Have a great day and come back soon. The last patron strode wordlessly out of the building, allowing the platitude to fall into the puddles of its death. The soft schlick of the door sliding shut. That was the only response his farewell would have. He lumbered toward the cracked plastic light switches, and, in the moment, it was bathed in darkness. All 4,000 square feet of it. Books, magazines, newspapers, even a few VHS tapes. All silent, all dark. Each item exactly where it belonged. Most library administrators waited until the end of the day to put away all returned items, but not Marcus. When a patron came to return an item, he stood up, scanned it into the system, and didn't sit down again until it was right back where it belonged. That way, he could leave the moment the library closed. That way, he could spend more time at home. The idea made him smile for a half second. He donned a once grey, once fitted hoodie and made for the exit. But something caught his eye. Something right on the edge of the administration desk. A series of videocassettes, 5 of them in total, and they seemed to be part of a set. Huh? Someone must have kept them there when he wasn't looking. No big deal. Put them away and head home. It wouldn't take a minute. He powered up the desktop once again, waited for the CRT to flicker into life, and aimed the scanner gun at the spine of the first cassette. The dim red light lit up the whole desk until the computer pinged once. Item not found. Odd. Marcus examined the barcode and saw that it was a bit faded, a bit distorted. Someone must have spilled water on it. Water or Coke or beer. That wasn't a problem. Key in the digits beneath the code manually. Item not found. The same block text appeared for the others too, whether Marcus scanned or keyed them in. Curious. How curious. He had a mystery on his hand. Each cassette cover was simple, white, blank. He ran his finger over them, a deviation, and squinted through age and tiredness to see Roman numerals from 1 through 5. For a moment, he considered leaving the cassettes where they were and dealing with the problem the next day. Or perhaps there was a meeting room at the far side of the library with a TV. Perhaps he could watch them there. No, not that. He never liked that cold, dark, dusty room at the back of the building, and he never found out what made it smell funny. Besides, it was now 5:05 p.m. 5 minutes lost to his job. 5 minutes that he'd never get back. He tucked the cassettes under an arm. Then he left the library, faring himself well, since no one else would. He was walking alone in the rain and the cold. There were trees to his right and a dark 2-lane road to his left. Now and then, a deviation from the main road led to neighborhoods. Collections of houses far greater than anything he ever had or ever would live in. Then, at 6:08 p.m., he arrived. It was already 6:08 p.m. 5 minutes of the journey he could blame on the time wasted after work, a few more on the cold and the wet, but it usually took him barely 40 minutes to get home. Then it usually took him another 3 to get to his room, suite number 505. Maybe his health was failing at last. Maybe he'd care about that someday. "I'm home," Marcus called to the roaches. sending them scurrying under the dinged baseboards and stained floors. He locked the knob and the deadbolt and then slid down a latch at the top of the door. The security precautions were a necessity, given the condition of the neighbourhood. Forget that his was a dingy 200 square foot studio unit with a plywood counter and a rusted sink that masqueraded as a kitchen. Everyone here got robbed. Even he had when he had just moved in. But the joke was on the robbers. He didn't have anything worth robbing. A dresser with clothes, a dented crackpot, a stained mattress that lay directly on the laminate tile floor, a TV which barely clung to the ability to produce colour. Marcus was the lord of all he surveyed. He slid the first cassette of the series into the VHS player underneath his TV. Then he sat down on his bed, searching for the remote, until he remembered he didn't have one. So he reached forward, pressed play, and sat back down. The green display on the VCR read, "Tracking," for a moment. A very long moment. And then it began to play. A dusty white room viewed from the corner of the ceiling appeared on the screen. At the periphery of visibility, there was a TV on a stand, but the camera seemed to be centered on a man. A big, balding man in a chair, staring intently at the TV screen. It was hard to tell. The video quality was so bad, but it looked like the man was panting, gasping for air, as if he had just run a marathon, or down the street given his weight. Then the video ended. Marcus stared at the blank screen for a moment. Then he ejected the cassette from the player and saw that whoever had seen it last hadn't rewound it. Typical people these days. True, there was no Be Kind Rewind sticker on the cover, but still. He rewound the cassette on his own and hit play again, this time starting the video from the very beginning. And again, it showed a room viewed seemingly from a security camera in the corner of the ceiling. But this was a hospital room, an emergency room from the look of it. A doctor and 2 or 3 nurses dashed around a screaming woman, trying to keep her stable, trying to keep her still. But as Marcus watched, her electrocardiogram flatlined. She was dead. That realization struck Marcus hard, though he couldn't fathom why. This was just a movie after all. Just now, the actress was probably reclining on a couch in Hollywood somewhere, or if her career had failed, her position was no worse than his. Wait a moment. The medical staff was still shouting at each other and preparing for something. Something, but what? Their patient was dead, and there was nothing they could do to change that now. And then, the unthinkable happened. Right on screen, right as Marcus watched, the doctor took the biggest, sharpest scalpel he had and opened the woman from hip to hip. Blood began to spill over the blankets onto the floor with such realism that Marcus retched. From the gory mess, the doctor pulled forth a squirming, shrieking baby. The video ended with a crackle of static and then darkness. And the clock on the VCR suggested that Marcus had been watching it, spellbound, for a full 2 hours. But why? Why had he spent 2 hours of his life watching a... He didn't even know what to call the film. It was like a medical documentary, but there was no narration, nothing to help Marcus understand what was going on and what had gone wrong. And now that he thought of it, what on earth happened to that strange segment he'd seen first, of the man in the seat staring at the TV? He ejected the cassette to see if the tape had snarled up or gone off track, but nothing was apparently wrong. That segment had just vanished, apparently. A stream of water dripped down the corner of the apartment and puddled onto the floor. But Marcus couldn't fix it, and the landlord wouldn't fix it, and he still had 4 more cassettes to watch. Static, noise, then darkness, then a series of white and blue vertical lines that coalesced into houses. A neighborhood, a sunlit, wooded, working-class neighborhood. A cameraman wandered through a neighborhood of some sort, but he couldn't hold the camera straight, and he breathed in a loud, labored sort of manner, as if he'd just run a marathon, or down the block if he was fat enough. He stopped after a few blocks and seemed to take cover, half sulking next to a slumped over shed in someone's backyard. From there, he zoomed in, slowly, and attempted to focus on a series of small silhouettes that darted around in another, farther off backyard. Children, laughing, squealing, playing children. The picture was blurred and too shaky to make much sense of. But, after a time, Marcus inferred that he was watching a party of some sort. Perhaps a birthday party. For some reason, someone had thought it would make a good video to peek at a children's birthday party. It was as if he was a voyeur of some sort. Marcus coughed mucus into the sleeve of his shirt and lumbered toward the TV and VHS player to shut both the damn things off. He didn't know what he was watching, but he didn't want to watch it. And that was when he realized that the roads in that neighborhood, the trees, even that rickety old shed that the cameraman was hiding behind, he recognized them. They were all from the neighborhood he'd grown up in. The party. The song began in that shrill, out of tune, out of beat way that it always did. Happy birthday to you, the children warbled. Happy birthday to you. The cameraman sneezed or coughed or something before refocusing on the party. Happy birthday, dear Freddy. Happy birthday to you. The final tone stuck for a moment before the picture faded and then went black. The cassette was finished, but Marcus stared at the screen for a long time afterwards anyway. Freddy. Who on earth was Freddy? And why had someone decided to make a movie out of his birthday party? And then Marcus remembered Whitey. Whitey, everyone called him, for his pale blonde hair. But his real name was Freddy. He and Marcus had been best friends until he had died of a bad cold in the 3rd grade. And this birthday party, Marcus had attended it. It had been Freddy's last birthday ever. A lone tear rolled down one of his cheeks. It had been decades since he thought of Freddy, but he had known the kid and his father well. They weren't the sort to allow a filmmaker into their lives, so this movie, whatever it was, there had to be something about it that Marcus was missing. He ejected part 2 and slid part 3 in, reflecting that he now knew why Freddy didn't talk about his mother. She had died in childbirth too. The familiar static and blackness morphed into more blackness, but not a single line of distortion crossed the screen in the moments that followed, nor did the familiar loud pink noise play from the speakers. There was only that familiar, loud, haggard breathing, and the sound of heavy footsteps crushing into some sort of wet, yielding surface. An owl hoot in the distance, and then the camera panned up and focused on a full moon. When it panned down and the cameraman began to walk again, several trees were illuminated by the light of the stars. Distant contours in the landscape suggested mountains were nearby. Laughter pierced the forest, soft, private laughter. And through the trees, the camera found a path to a dancing red and yellow light. This seemed to be the destination of the cameraman, a campfire. He got closer to the fire, and closer still, until he must have had a hand or cloth over his mouth to avoid being heard over the crackle of the burning logs. On the far side of the fire, a couple sat, arm in arm, feeding each other s'mores, whispered conversation, and sweet soft kisses. One of them, presumed the man, took out a small silver harmonica and started to play, his lover in his arms. The sound quality was horrible, awful, and at that distance, over the noise of the crackling fire, the tiny squeal of the harmonica was distorted into near inaudibility. The rare note that had managed audibility was off-key more often than not, but enough of them, spaced closely enough together, made Marcus realize. Greensleeves. The man was playing Greensleeves. It seemed to be all he could play, because he repeated it a few times before he and his girl retired into the tent, arm in arm, kissing the whole way. Laughter, soft, low moans, whispered oaths. The cameraman waited and watched the whole time, breathing louder and louder as the couple's lovemaking came to a close. In time, the last smouldering ember of the fire died out, and with that, the cameraman was on the move again, using the light of the stars and the moon to guide him. He strode up to the tent, right up to the door of the tent, and then circled around to the side. He then focused on that orange nylon surface, or perhaps what was beyond it. And there he remained for a long, long, long time. At some point, the camera panned right. A snivelling, whimpering something sat on the ground, shivering and soiling itself as the cameraman got closer. It was a dog, a brown and black, shaggy dog with a red collar and leash holding it in place. And the name on the collar was... The video ended before the camera focused on those 5 etched letters, but Marcus knew what they were. Riley. He had never been the same after that camping trip, when Marcus had taken his then girlfriend to the forest and asked her to marry him. He stared at the TV screen for one moment longer. Then, scrabbling at the bed, the cassettes and the roaches had hidden beneath them. He exchanged the 3rd cassette for the 4th. Your Honor, Your Honor. Every sentence she made them call her, Your Honor. And if you forget, she'd correct you and make you start speaking all over again. It was enough to irritate the most professional of lawyers and the layabouts Marcus had managed to afford. Propositioning his clients, battering opposing counsel, driving by their homes late at night. And just the other day, he cornered Marcus's wife in the waiting room and told her how stupid she was, loudly enough for everyone to hear. It was almost enough for Marcus to do something about it. Almost. Then he remembered their anniversary. Their 15th anniversary. The kids were in school, and he'd come home from work early. He brought wine and flowers and chocolates and a new ring, and he'd entered his house silently, and his bedroom too. And so, he had been able to watch for several moments as his wife did things with her lover that she'd never done with him. The courtroom was viewed through a security camera. Her Honor entered and all rose, and then all sat, and the deliberations began. And so Marcus was forced to relive the moments when he'd lost everything he'd worked so hard to gain. The kids, the house, his pension and retirement fund. She'd taken most of them because her lawyer was a pro, an expert at painting him as an absent, callous husband who cared so little for his wife that she was the victim, really, that her minor indiscretions were the result of years of loneliness and neglect which amounted to emotional abuse. The gavel was pounded. Marcus watched himself and his useless lawyer exit the courtroom, heads hung. He remembered. There were still a few details to be ironed out, and so they had carpooled to the lawyer's office. Marcus hadn't the money for that much gas. The security camera footage ended, and now the cameraman was back. The loud breathing cameraman with shaky hands. He was sulking next to a series of bushes at the far end of the parking lot, watching Marcus and his lawyer enter their shared car. And then he entered his own car. Marcus couldn't see what it was, and followed them. It was cold that day, and dark, but there was no rain. There was little traffic too, and that meant that the cameraman was able to keep them in frame, even when he hung a mile or more back behind them. He followed them all 20 miles to the lawyer's practice, panting the whole way. He didn't stop when their car pulled off the road and into the lawyer's parking lot. He just kept driving. If anything, he drove faster and swerved a bit to the side so that a puddle of oily water on the road was kicked up and doused Marcus. That moment, he remembered that. He remembered spitting and swearing and shrieking at the departing BMW. And he remembered hearing, or thinking that he was hearing something like laughter, but at the same time, so completely different from laughter. And now he heard it again, as the cameraman drove off into the distance. It was a grinding, huffing guffaw that didn't sound human or animal. And then the screen was all white, all at once. Voices approached, muffled footsteps, and then slowly, the camera began to focus. It was another security camera, or something like a security camera, set in the corner of the ceiling and a wall, in the lawyer's office, and it had just turned on as he and Marcus entered. There they were, sitting across from one another with that big, fine oak desk between them. The lawyer poured a few fingers of scotch for each of them, and they began to talk. For an hour they sat there, hashing out the final details of the end of Marcus's marriage, before they stood and shook hands. The lawyer offered Marcus a ride. Marcus said that he'd rather walk. The video might have ended there. It should have. But then, just then, after the front door of the practice opened and shut, Marcus's lawyer turned and looked at the camera in the corner of his ceiling and wall. The expression on his face twisted from a sad smile into a grimace of pure dread. He was walking alone in the rain and the cold. There were trees to his right and a dark two-lane to his left. Now and then, a deviation from the main road led to neighborhoods, collections of houses far greater than anything he ever had or ever would live in. A lone, beat-up Chevrolet passed him by, blaring some mixture of rap and rock music, and as it vanished into the distance, it began again. The breathing, that haggard, heavy, laboured breathing. The cameraman had followed him home from work one day. One rainy, cold, dark day, just like today. Such days were uncommon in the area. But when Marcus saw it, tucked under his arm, peeking at the camera through the gap between his chest and his hoodie, this video series, in their white covers with no titles or markings. The cameraman was watching him walk home, carrying the same video cassette that was playing right now. He followed Marcus all the way home, and then, from the sidewalk, focused on the leaky, stained window that was his, until the light came on. And there the cameraman stayed, shaking, breathing, staring at the window. Marcus turned to look at the window himself, wiped a cold, wet, salty sheen from his cheek, crept forward with one quivering hand reaching toward the blinds. And then the cameraman was on the move again. Apparently holding his breath, he approached the apartment building. He paused at the door, holding something in front of the key fob reader that made it ping and allowed him entry. Then he entered the stairwell and began to climb upward, stair by stair. He or she or it, whatever it was, passed the second floor, then the third, then the fourth, then began to make its way down the main corridor of the fifth floor. It stopped about halfway through and turned to the left, panning up and down and then up again, focusing on the worn masking tape identifier just above the painted over eye hole, number 505. Marcus was now the one breathing loudly, laboriously. He turned to his side, placed a hand on his bed, and slowly, carefully pushed himself to his feet. He crept to his door, then threw it open with a shout, and nothing happened. No one was there. Nothing was there, except for the same graffiti and cigarette butts that had always been there. And the rain, of course, welcomed in by the windows shattered years before. Marcus peered out at the street, at the spot, the precise point where the cameraman must have stood before entering his building and standing right where he was standing now. And then he screamed and went back into his apartment, slamming the door shut behind him. Seething, shaking, he pressed the rewind button on the VHS player. He had to see it again, to know what had happened. But before the motors could even spin up to best speed, they paused and caught. And then there was a crackle of electricity, and then the VHS player vomited a burned, ruined cassette tape. Marcus stared at the machine for a moment. Then he slapped it off the TV. Then he slapped the TV off the stand. Then he began to scream. And then something caught his eye, and he picked up the cassette covers again. All 5 of them. He thought that the Roman numeral on each of them was their only identifying marker, but he was wrong. Just next to each of the numbers, 1 through 5, there was a slash, so faint that it was invisible to a glance. Marcus's closer examination picked it up though. It, and the 6 just next to it. Through the rain and the cold, and now that the sun was long set, through the dark too, Marcus began the journey with a quick jog. It was only asthma that slowed him down. Asthma and age, and the bad knee that he couldn't afford to have someone look at. And now his voice was laboured and haggard too, just like the cameraman's. If it even was a man, or woman, or human, or animal at all. Wait a moment. That was his voice, wasn't it? Wasn't it? Marcus held his breath, but the heavy panting growl didn't stop. It was there, right there, something moving beyond the trees, in the forest adjacent to the road. But what? What was it? Imagination. That's what it was. Imagination. In his shock, Marcus had forgotten to hold his breath, and he was breathing again in a manner that almost sounded like what he'd heard. His nerves were playing tricks on him, and to avoid this, he walked faster, and resolved not to hold his breath again. In time, he made it to the library, waterlogged and chilled to the bone. Teeth chattering, he entered and turned on the light. And there it was, right where its 5 predecessors had been, cased in a white paper cover. 6 out of 6. The last part. He took it and made for the door. And that was when Marcus remembered the room. The meeting room at the far end of the library that he didn't like to visit. There was a TV in there and a VHS player, and then he was dashing through the empty, echoing library toward that foreboding, solid oak door. He threw it open, entered the dusty, chilly room, and turned on the overhead fluorescent, bathing the whole place in bright, piercing white light. The smell, he ignored it. The TV and VHS player were just there, both plugged in, both powered on, both in front of a lone rolling chair. The table and the other chairs had been shoved off to the side of the room. He was panting from the run, shivering from the cold. He collapsed into the seat, the cassette still in his hand. Then he glanced at the VHS player's dim green display. Tracking, it read. Tracking. Then, part 6. Then, play. But still, the TV buzzed with static noise. The volume was turned on, all the way up in fact, but the whole room was bathed in silence. Pure, absolute silence, but for Marcus's ragged gasping. The screen changed slowly. There was something behind the flickering static. But what was it? The quality was so poor. Marcus had to lean forward in his seat. In fact, he had to stare at the TV, unblinking, until he saw what it was. A fat man in a chair, leaning forward and staring at what might be a TV on a stand, just out of the camera's view. The last segment of part 1 of 6. The brief clip at the end that had vanished when he tried to see it again. The cassette still in his hands. And it had been filmed. In the past? In the future? Did it matter? Marcus held his breath, but still, that laboured, haggard breathing was there in the room with him. He turned, looked to where the ceiling met the wall. And then the video ended. And then Marcus ended.